8 months after we buried my husband, my stepson stood up in a courtroom and told a judge that I was no longer fit to understand what I owned, and the only proof he offered was a letter from a doctor I had met exactly once, for 11 minutes, 6 weeks earlier. The hearing room smelled like old carpet and cold coffee. A radiator ticked somewhere behind the bench. I sat at the respondent's table in the navy dress I had worn to Edward's memorial, because it was the only dress in my closet that still felt like armor, my hands folded in my lap, the way my own mother taught me to fold them in church 70 years ago. Colton stood at the petitioner's table beside his attorney, a tall man with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop, and when his lawyer paused to let a particular sentence land, Colton looked directly at me and said the thing I have not been able to fully stop hearing since. "This isn't about the money, Francis. It's about keeping you safe from yourself." He said it gently. That was the part that still catches in my chest when I let myself think about it. Not the cruelty of it, but the gentleness, the practiced, patient gentleness of a man who had rehearsed sounding like he loved me, right up until the moment it became useful not to. I did not raise my voice, I did not look away from him, and I did not look down at my hands either, though some small, old part of me wanted to. I set my reading glasses down on the table in front of me, folded my hands over them, and let the radiator tick 3 more times before anyone in that room said another word. What Colton did not know, what none of them knew, not his attorney, not the doctor whose signature sat at the bottom of that letter, not even, I suspect, my stepson himself, in the fullest sense, was that 8 months of quiet grief had not been the only thing I'd spent since Edward's funeral. I had spent some of it learning exactly how much protection a careful, private man can build for his wife without ever once telling her he was building it. And by the time Colton stood up in that courtroom to tell a judge I couldn't be trusted with my own life, the most important part of my defense had already been sitting in a filing cabinet for 10 years, waiting for a day none of us had wanted to imagine. I want to tell you what was in that filing cabinet, but first, if anyone has ever stood over you, speaking gently, telling you it was for your own good, while quietly taking something that was never theirs to take, I want you to tell me where you're watching from tonight. Stay with me, because the letter Colton's attorney was holding up like a trophy was about to matter a great deal less than the letter nobody in that room yet knew existed. Subscribe if you believe that grief does not make a woman foolish. Then let me take you back to the beginning, because by the time Colton said those words to me in that cold hearing room, the outcome had already been decided. He simply hadn't been told yet. My name is Francis Sinclair. I am 72 years old, and for 31 years I was married to a man who measured twice and cut once, in absolutely everything he did, right down to the last quiet arrangement he made for me before his heart finally gave out. I met Edward when I was 41, working the reference desk at the county library in Ashford Hills, Ohio, a job I'd taken after my first marriage ended, and I needed something steady to rebuild a life around. Edward came in most Thursday evenings to return engineering journals 2 weeks late and pay the fine without complaint. And it took him 4 months of Thursdays to work up the nerve to ask if I'd like to get coffee sometime, which I have always found funny, because by then the man had already built half the overpasses on the east side of the county and negotiated million-dollar contracts without blinking. Confidence, it turned out, was not the same thing as courage. Edward had plenty of the first. It took me to teach him the second, at least where his own heart was concerned. He'd been divorced 11 years by the time we met, with 2 children from that marriage. Colton, who was 15 then, already sharp-edged and watchful in the particular way boys get when their parents' marriage ends badly, and Paige, 12, quieter, the kind of child who watches a room before she decides how to feel about it. I did not try to become their mother. I was clear about that from the very first dinner Edward arranged for the 4 of us, at a diner that no longer exists, over milkshakes neither child finished. I told them I already had a mother of their own, a good one, and that all I wanted was to be someone else in their corner, if they'd have me. Paige warmed to that slowly, over years, the way some children do. Colton never did. Not really, though for a long time I told myself that was simply his nature, and that beneath the watchfulness was a boy who'd simply had his family broken once already and didn't trust that a second one would hold. I think often now about a particular Saturday in the second spring of our marriage when I drove out alone to watch Colton play in a junior varsity baseball game because Edward was inspecting a bridge deck 2 states away and had asked me, almost shyly, whether I'd mind going in his place so the boy wouldn't have to look up into the stands and find nobody there. Colton struck out twice that afternoon and popped up weakly his 3rd time at bat, and when I met him by the chain-link fence afterward with a cold soda and told him I'd been proud of how hard he'd swung at every pitch, he looked at me with an expression I would spend the next 3 decades learning to recognize. Not quite gratitude, but something closer to careful accounting, as though he were tallying whether my showing up had cost him some debt he hadn't agreed to take on. "You don't have to keep doing this," he told me, not unkindly, just flatly. "I have a mother," he did, of course, 2 states away, a woman who called dutifully on birthdays, and little else, which was its own quiet grief I never once tried to compete with or explain away to him. It took me years to stop hearing an accusation folded inside that sentence. It took me longer still to understand that Colton was not rejecting me so much as refusing, on some private principle he'd built for himself very young, to owe gratitude to anyone he had not personally chosen to let in. Paige chose me almost by accident, the way children sometimes do, over something so small that I doubt either of us could have told you afterward whose idea it had actually been. She was 13 the winter she came down with a bad flu during one of Edward's longer work trips, and I sat up with her 3 nights running, reading aloud from a stack of mystery novels she'd been too feverish to hold herself. Somewhere around the 2nd night, half delirious and drowsy, she reached over without opening her eyes and took my hand and told me I had a good reading voice, better than her mother's. I don't know that she remembered saying it once the fever broke. I have never once forgotten it. It is such a small thing to build 30 years of closeness on, and yet I have come to believe that is precisely how the sturdiest bonds in a blended family actually get made. Not in one grand reconciling scene, but in 100 unremarkable Tuesdays where somebody simply stays in the room until the worst of it passes. That difference in temperament followed both children into adulthood almost exactly the way you would predict, if you were watching from a distance the way I sometimes made myself do, trying to be fair to a boy who made fairness difficult. Paige called me most Sunday evenings for a decade before Edward died, not from any sense of duty but from the plain habit of 2 people who enjoyed each other's company. Colton called precisely on my birthday and precisely at Christmas, with a warmth that always felt, even at its best, faintly rehearsed, the practiced warmth of a man who had decided in advance exactly what kind of son he intended to be seen as, rather than a man simply being one without having to decide it first. I want to be fair to him even now, knowing everything I eventually learned, because fairness has always mattered to me more than being right. Colton was never cruel to me in those years. He was correct. He remembered anniversaries. He sent appropriate gifts. He stood at an appropriate distance at every family gathering, close enough that no one could accuse him of neglect, far enough that no one could mistake it for warmth. It took me most of my adult life to understand that correctness and closeness are not the same currency, and that a man can spend 30 years being unfailingly correct to a woman while privately deciding, somewhere beneath all that correctness, that she had taken something from him on the day his father fell in love with her. I did not understand any of that the day I met Renata, at a company picnic the summer Colton turned 26, 3 years before their wedding. I liked her immediately, and without reservation, a warm, quick-laughing woman who worked then as a hospital administrator and who treated me, from that very first afternoon, with none of her future husband's careful accounting. At their wedding, she insisted I be seated at the family table, rather than tucked among the extended relatives, over what I later learned was Colton's mild objection, and she hugged me afterward and told me she was glad Edward had found someone who made him laugh again the way people said he used to, before his first marriage ended so badly. I did not know, watching her dance with my stepson that evening in a room full of candlelight and rented chairs, that I was looking at a woman who would spend the next decade slowly absorbing her husband's old grievances as her own, one patient, gentle, late-night conversation at a time, until the two of them could finish each other's justifications without ever having to say the harder parts out loud to anyone else, including, I would later come to believe, themselves. I do not tell you any of this to excuse what Colton eventually did. I tell you because I think it matters to understand that he did not become the man who stood up in that courtroom overnight, or even over the 8 months since his father's funeral. He had been keeping some private ledger of his own for the better part of 3 decades, long before he ever had a legal theory or a compliant doctor to attach it to. Grief, when it finally came for him, did not create that resentment out of nothing. It simply handed him, for the first time in his adult life, an opening he felt he had finally earned the right to use. Edward built Sinclair and Cole Engineering from a 2-man consulting office above a hardware store into one of the largest structural firms in the state. 40 years of bridges and hospital wings and highway interchanges bearing his stamp somewhere in their permit files, long after most people forget an engineer's name is attached to anything at all. He sold his controlling stake 9 years before he died, folded the proceeds into a diversified portfolio he managed himself with the same patient, unglamorous discipline he'd applied to every structural calculation of his career, and by the time his heart first gave him real trouble, the estate he'd built was substantial enough that I understood, even then, it would eventually need protecting from something. I simply did not yet know what. Edward's heart trouble started 11 years ago. Nothing dramatic at first, an irregular rhythm his cardiologist wanted to monitor, medication adjustments, the ordinary business of a man in his 60s, learning his body had limits, his mind had never quite accepted. It was around that time, in the quiet, methodical way Edward did everything that actually mattered, that he asked me to sit down with him and a trust attorney neither of us had met before, a woman named Camille Ostrander, whose office was 2 floors above a bank downtown. "I want to set something up," Edward told me the night before that first meeting, sitting across from me at our kitchen table with a legal pad he'd already half filled with his small, precise engineer's handwriting. "Not because I don't trust you to manage money, Francis. You've managed a household budget more carefully than most CFOs I've worked with. I want to set it up because I don't trust what happens to people, even good people, when a large amount of money suddenly sits in front of them without anyone else watching." I asked him, half teasing, whether he meant me. "I mean anyone," he said, not teasing back. "I mean Colton. I mean whoever Colton marries, whoever Paige marries, whoever either of them becomes in 20 years, that neither of us can predict from this kitchen table tonight. I built bridges for a living, Francis. Every bridge I ever designed had a margin of safety built in for loads it would probably never actually carry, because probably isn't a word you build a bridge around. I want to build the same kind of margin into what happens to you after I'm gone, not because I expect the worst from our children, because I refuse to leave you standing on a bridge I didn't bother to over-engineer, just because the worst case felt unlikely the day I drew the plans." That was Edward in one sentence, more than almost anything else I could tell you about him. He did not distrust his children. He distrusted certainty about the future, on principle, the same careful skepticism that had kept every structure he ever designed standing through storms nobody had specifically predicted when the concrete was poured. We drove downtown the next morning and sat in Camille Ostrander's office for the better part of 3 hours, and what came out of that morning was an irrevocable trust, funded with the bulk of Edward's investment portfolio and his share of the proceeds from the firm, with a corporate trustee, not a family member, not even Camille herself, but a trust company officer named Nathaniel Kessler, whom neither of us had met before that week, and who had absolutely no relationship with Colton, with Paige, or with anyone else who might one day stand to gain from influencing how the money moved. The trust would provide for me for the rest of my life, administered by Nathaniel and the institution he represented, according to terms Edward wrote with the same unglamorous precision he brought to every load calculation of his career. Neither Colton nor Page were trustees. Neither Colton nor Page could petition to remove Nathaniel except through an extraordinarily narrow legal process requiring proof of actual misconduct, not merely family disagreement. And critically, this was the sentence Camille had me read twice, out loud, before I signed anything. No court-appointed guardian of my person, or my remaining personal assets, would have any authority whatsoever over trust property, which would continue to be administered solely by the independent trustee, regardless of any finding made about my capacity in any other proceeding. I remember the particulars of that room better than I remember most rooms I have sat in since. Camille's office had a window that looked out over the bank's parking lot, and a ficus in the corner that had clearly survived on neglect and fluorescent light alone, and she kept a yellow legal pad in front of her that she filled, page after page, in handwriting almost as small and precise as Edward's own. She was, I would guess, close to 50 at the time, sharp-featured and unhurried in a way that put both of us at ease within the first 10 minutes, and she had a habit, which I came to appreciate more with every year that passed, of stopping every few provisions to ask, "Do you understand why this clause exists, or would it help if I told you the specific situation it's meant to prevent?" Edward always wanted the specific situation. He was, after all, a man who had spent his whole career designing for failure modes other people preferred not to imagine. "This is the successor trustee provision," Camille told us, tapping a page near the middle of the draft. "If Nathaniel Kessler becomes unable or unwilling to serve, retirement, death, misconduct, anything, the trust doesn't fall to whoever happens to be standing nearest at the time. It falls to a corporate successor named here, a bank trust department, with the same independence requirement built in. No family member ever becomes trustee by default. That's not an accident. That's the entire architecture. And if Colton or Page someday believe Nathaniel, or whoever comes after him, is mismanaging things," Edward asked, "what's their recourse? I don't want this to be a black box nobody can question." "They can petition for an accounting at any time, as beneficiaries, and the trustee is legally required to provide one," Camille said. "They can also petition for removal, but only on the specific legal grounds the statute allows, actual breach of fiduciary duty, not simply disagreement with a discretionary decision they don't like. That distinction matters enormously, Mr. Sinclair. Without it, any beneficiary who's unhappy with a distribution decision could tie the trustee up in litigation forever, and the whole protective purpose collapses. With it, the trust can actually do the job you're building it to do." I asked, at one point that morning, whether all of this seemed excessive, whether Edward and I were, in some sense, insulting our own children by planning this carefully against them. Camille set her pen down before she answered, which I noticed even then, because it meant she wanted me to hear the answer as something more than routine reassurance. "Mrs. Sinclair, I've drafted probably 400 of these in my career," she said. "The families who end up in my office fighting each other in a courtroom are almost never the ones who plan too carefully. They're the ones who assumed love would be sufficient organization on its own, and found out, usually at the worst possible moment, that love and structure are not the same thing, and one cannot substitute for the other when a large amount of money is sitting on a table with nobody watching it. What you're doing today isn't an insult to your children. It's very possibly the kindest thing you'll ever do for them, because it means none of you will ever have to find out, the hard way, which one of them might have needed the guardrail." I did not know, sitting in that office with my hands folded in my lap and Edward's steady presence beside me, that Camille Ostrander's words would return to me 11 years later, verbatim, in a hearing room 3 miles from where we sat that morning. I only knew, when we finally rose to leave, that Edward shook her hand for a long moment and told her she'd just done more good in 3 hours than most people manage in a lifetime, and that I laughed and told him he was being dramatic, and that he looked at me, entirely serious, and said he did not think he was being dramatic at all. I did not fully understand, that morning, why Edward wanted that particular sentence written so carefully. I understood it 11 years later, standing in a cold hearing room, listening to my stepson explain to a judge that I was no longer safe to be trusted with my own life. There was a night, 4 years before Edward died, that I have thought about more since the hearing than I ever thought about it while it was actually happening. Edward's heart stopped him cold at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, a real event this time, not the irregular flutter his cardiologist had been monitoring for years. Chest pain sharp enough that he went gray in the face at the kitchen table and told me, with the maddening calm he brought to every crisis of his life, "I think we should go to the hospital now, Francis, not in a few minutes." I drove him myself, faster than I have ever driven in my life, and spent the following 3 days in a vinyl chair beside a hospital bed, while doctors ran the kind of tests that make you understand, all at once and without any patience for your feelings about it, exactly how temporary everything is. Paige flew in the next morning from the conference she'd been attending and did not leave the hospital except to shower for the better part of 3 days, sleeping in the chair beside mine, bringing me coffee I didn't ask for but drank anyway, because refusing it would have taken more energy than I had. Colton arrived the same afternoon, and I want to be fair in how I describe what he did, because at the time, it read to me as nothing more than a son's practical mind working the only way it knew how to work under stress. He asked the attending physician detailed, specific questions about Edward's prognosis, about long-term care possibilities, about what a second event might mean for quality of life going forward. He asked, on the second day, almost in passing, whether Edward's affairs were all in order, and when I told him, a little sharply, that his father's health was the only thing that mattered to me in that room, he apologized at once, gently, and said he only wanted to make sure nothing would blindside any of us later. It sounded at the time like responsibility. It would take me years and a courtroom to recognize it, instead as the earliest visible edge of something that had been forming in him for a long time already, waiting for an opening serious enough to justify asking the question out loud. Edward recovered. The cardiologist adjusted his medication, scheduled a procedure that went well, and sent him home 10 days later with new instructions and the same stubborn refusal to slow down that had defined him for 60-some years. But something in him had shifted, quietly, in the way I would only fully understand in hindsight. The night before he was discharged, he asked me to sit on the edge of his hospital bed, and he took my hand in both of his grip still weaker than I liked, and he told me that lying in that bed for 3 days had clarified something for him. "I keep thinking about the trust," he said, "not because I don't trust Camille's work, or Nathaniel. I trust both of them completely. I keep thinking about you, sitting exactly where you're sitting right now, except it's not me in this bed. I want you to promise me something, Francis, and I want you to actually promise it, not just nod at me the way you do when you think I'm being overly careful about something." I told him I was listening. "If anything ever happens to me, not this, something further off, years from now, I hope, and anyone at all, starts telling you that you need help managing your own life, in a tone that sounds kind, but doesn't quite let you finish your own sentences, I want you to call Camille first, before you call anyone else, even before you call Paige. Not because I don't trust Paige, because Camille is the one person in all of this who has absolutely nothing to gain either way, and in my experience, engineering and otherwise, the person with nothing to gain is usually the one worth listening to first." I promised him, I did not, in that hospital room with the machines still beeping their steady, reassuring rhythm beside us, imagine I would ever actually need to keep that promise. I have thought, many times since the hearing, about how strange it is that the people we love sometimes see further down the road than we do, not because they are wiser, necessarily, but because loving someone carefully enough, for long enough, means occasionally forcing yourself to imagine the versions of the future you would most rather not. Edward and I did not speak of that conversation again for years. It sat quietly in both of us, the way the most important promises often do, waiting. Edward's heart gave out for the last time on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months before that hearing, while he was reading the newspaper at our kitchen table, with his coffee going cold beside him. He did not suffer, the doctors told me afterward, which is the small mercy you cling to when there is very little else to cling to. I will not spend long on the months that followed, because grief does not make for much of a story. It is simply a room you learn to walk through differently every day, bumping into the same furniture in slightly less painful ways as the weeks accumulate. I will tell you only that Paige came and sat with me most evenings that first month, and that Colton came to the funeral, delivered a composed and generous eulogy about his father's work ethic, and then, within 6 weeks, began visiting me with a frequency and a watchfulness that I initially mistook, because grief makes you generous with your interpretations of people, for a son finally learning how to grieve alongside a stepmother he'd spent 30 years keeping at arm's length. I want to tell you a little more about that day, because one moment from it has stayed with me in a way I did not understand until much later. The funeral was held at Ashford Hills Community Church, the same sanctuary where Edward and I had been married 31 years earlier, though neither of us had planned it that way. It was simply the largest sanctuary in town, and Edward, in the practical instructions he'd left with his attorney years before, had specified only that he wanted someplace that could hold everyone who actually knew me, not just everyone who knew of me. 400 people came. Men he'd trained as young engineers 30 years earlier flew in from 3 states away. A retired county commissioner spoke for 6 minutes about a bridge Edward had fought the county council to build correctly, over budget, rather than cheaply and on schedule. A bridge that was still standing without a single structural repair, a quarter-century later, while 2 cheaper bridges built the same year had already been condemned. Colton's eulogy came near the end, and I remember it because it was, by any fair account, a genuinely good eulogy, composed, warm, specific in the way that tells a room someone actually paid attention to the person they're describing, rather than reciting something generic. He talked about learning to ride a bicycle in our driveway, about Edward's habit of explaining load-bearing physics using dinner rolls and butter knives at the table until Paige begged him to stop, about the particular quality of quiet pride Edward carried rather than announced. He did not mention me by name once in 11 minutes, which I noticed and forgave instantly, that day, telling myself grief makes people forget things that don't actually matter. I understand now that it was not forgetting. It was, I believe, already the beginning of a story Colton was constructing for himself, a story in which his father's life and legacy belonged, primarily, to the 2 children who carried his blood, with everyone else, myself included, positioned somewhere in the margins of the account. At the reception afterward, in the church's fellowship hall under fluorescent lights nobody had thought to dim, Colton found me by the coffee urn and hugged me for a long moment, longer than I expected, and told me, quietly, that he intended to step up now, to make sure I wasn't carrying everything alone. I told him I appreciated that more than I could say in that moment, and I meant it entirely, without a single reservation, the way you mean things in the raw first hours of a loss that has not yet finished landing on you. Margaret Doyle, a longtime family friend who had known Edward since his first marriage, found me 20 minutes later refilling my coffee I had no intention of drinking, and said something I did not think much of at the time and have thought about often since. "He's a good boy at the funeral," she told me, nodding faintly toward Colton across the room, where he stood receiving condolences with the same composed warmth he'd shown at the podium. "Watch who he is at the reading of the will, Francis. That's when you learn what a person actually thinks they're owed." I laughed it off gently at the time, told her Colton had never once, in 31 years, given me reason to expect anything but decency from him. Margaret only patted my hand and said she hoped I was right, in the particular tone of a woman who has buried 2 husbands of her own and watched exactly this pattern play out in exactly this fellowship hall more than once before. Paige did not leave my side that entire afternoon. She fielded the well-meaning, exhausting condolences of distant cousins, so I wouldn't have to repeat the same 3 sentences 50 times, and at one point, when an elderly aunt of Edward's asked me, not unkindly, what I intended to do with all that money now, Paige stepped smoothly between us and redirected the conversation before I even had to find words for how much the question had stung. I remember thinking, driving home that evening in the passenger seat of Paige's car, because my own hands were shaking too badly to trust behind a wheel, that I had married into exactly the right daughter, whatever else the day had cost me. I did not yet know how completely I would need to lean on that fact in the months that followed. I did not understand, in those early weeks, that Colton was not learning to grieve alongside me, he was taking notes. The first incident happened in May, 10 weeks after the funeral. Colton and his wife Renata came for Sunday dinner, the way they had started doing most weeks since Edward died, and partway through the meal Colton asked, with the studied casualness of a man testing the depth of water before he steps in, whether I remembered agreeing to sell the lake cottage. I had not agreed to any such thing. Edward and I had owned a small cottage on Miller's Lake for 18 years, the one piece of property that had never gone anywhere near the trust, simply because it was small and sentimental, and Edward had wanted at least one thing between us that stayed uncomplicated by paperwork. I told Colton, plainly, that I had made no such decision and had no intention of selling it. "That's strange," he said, exchanging a brief, meaningful glance with Renata across the table. "You told me on the phone 2 weeks ago that it was getting to be too much upkeep for you alone, and that you wanted me to look into listing it. I even had a realtor friend draft some comparables." I remembered that phone call. I remembered it clearly, because I remember most things clearly, and what I had actually said was that the cottage's dock needed repair before summer, and that I wondered whether Colton knew anyone reliable who did that kind of work. Not a sale, a dock repair. I told him so, calmly, and Colton's expression did something I would come to recognize over the following months, a brief, almost imperceptible softening into patience, the specific patience people perform for someone they've already decided is not quite reliable. "Okay," he said, in the tone you use with a child who insists the sky is green. "Whatever you remember, Francis. It's not important. I'll just tell my friend to hold off on the listing." It was such a small thing. That is what I want you to understand about how this actually happens, not with one dramatic confrontation, but with a dock repair quietly rewritten into a phone call about selling the cottage, delivered with just enough warmth that objecting to it makes you sound more unreasonable than the misremembering itself would have. The second incident came in June. I keep a calendar in my kitchen, the old-fashioned kind that hangs on a nail by the pantry, and I had circled the date of my quarterly appointment with my internist weeks in advance, the way I always do. Colton showed up that Tuesday morning, an hour before the appointment, to drive me himself, a kindness, he said, since he happened to be in the area. When we arrived, the receptionist informed us, apologetically, that Dr. Reyes had actually rescheduled our visit for the following week, at Colton's own request, made by phone 3 days earlier. I had made no such call. I told the receptionist so. She checked her system, found a note logged under my name and phone number, and simply shrugged in the particular way people shrug when a computer disagrees with a customer, and the customer is old enough that her disagreement carries less weight than it should. In the car afterward, Colton patted my hand where it rested on my knee. "It's all right, Francis," he said. "These little mix-ups happen to everyone. I just want to make sure I'm around more, to help keep things straight for you." I did not argue. I want to be honest that some small, exhausted part of me, still raw from Edward's death, wondered for a moment whether he might be right, whether grief had loosened something in my memory that I simply hadn't noticed loosening. That is precisely the door this kind of thing is built to open. It does not ask you to believe you are losing your mind all at once. It asks you to wonder, just once, quietly, whether you might be, and then it waits for that single, unguarded moment of doubt to grow roots. The third incident came in late June, and this one I felt in my chest before I felt it anywhere else, because unlike the cottage or the appointment, this one touched something Edward had actually put directly into my hands. He had given me his mother's garnet ring on our 10th anniversary, reset into a new band because the original had worn thin, and I kept it in a small velvet box on my dresser, worn only on anniversaries and the rare formal occasion, precisely because it mattered too much to risk in the ordinary traffic of daily life. I went to wear it for what would have been our 32nd anniversary, 3 weeks after Edward's death, a private, quiet gesture I hadn't told anyone I intended to make, and found the velvet box empty. I searched my bedroom for 2 hours, before I called anyone, certain I had simply misplaced it in the fog of the previous months, checking coat pockets, and the lining of my good purse, and the back of every drawer in the room. When I finally called Colton, more out of habit than suspicion, to ask if he'd perhaps seen it during a recent visit, his answer arrived with a small, telling pause before it came. "You gave that to Renata, Francis," he said, "back in April. You said you wanted her to have something of Dad's mother's while you were both still close enough that it would mean something, instead of waiting until you weren't here to give it. Don't you remember?" she cried. "You hugged her in the kitchen." I remembered no such conversation, no such hug, no such kitchen scene, and I told him so, my voice steadier than I felt. Colton's tone softened instantly into the particular patience I had, by then, begun to recognize the shape of even before I could name it. "It's okay," he said. "It was an emotional time. A lot of things probably blur together from those first few weeks. I can ask Renata to bring it by, if it would put your mind at ease. Though I have to say, it might be a little hurtful to her, after how much that moment meant to her, to have it questioned now." I told him not to trouble Renata over it, that I was sure it would turn up, and I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed for a long while, running my hand along the inside seam of a coat pocket I had already checked twice, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the missing ring and everything to do with the sentence Colton had used. An emotional time, a lot of things probably blur together, offered so gently, so reasonably, that objecting to it a second time would have made me sound unreasonable in a way that simply agreeing would not have. I found the ring 6 days later, in the toe of a winter boot I hadn't worn since the previous February, exactly where I had apparently tucked it myself for safekeeping, sometime in the disordered weeks after the funeral, and then genuinely forgotten. A small, mundane, entirely human lapse with an entirely mundane explanation. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think honesty matters more here than a tidier version of this story would allow. I had, in fact, misplaced the ring myself. Colton had not taken it. What Colton had done, what I only recognized clearly months later, laying the whole summer out end to end in Camille's office, was notice my own small, ordinary lapse, and instantly, smoothly, without a moment's hesitation, reach for a story that recast it as something I had done and then forgotten, rather than something I had simply misplaced. A story specific enough, emotional enough, plausible enough that I very nearly believed it myself, rather than trust my own search of my own bedroom. I did not tell Colton I had found the ring. I am not entirely proud of that silence, even now, but some new, watchful part of me, waking up slowly that whole summer, wanted to see what he would say if the subject never came up again on its own. He never once asked. A man who genuinely believed his stepmother had gifted his wife a family heirloom, I came to think, might eventually wonder aloud whether Renata was wearing it yet. Colton never mentioned the ring again, not once, for the rest of that year, which told me, more clearly than almost anything else that summer, that the ring itself had never actually mattered to him at all. Only the shape of the doubt it could plant had mattered, and once it had done its quiet work, he had simply, efficiently, let it go. It was Paige who first said the word I had not yet let myself think. She came by on a Thursday afternoon in July, ostensibly to drop off a casserole dish she'd borrowed the month before, though I have long suspected my stepdaughter manufactures small errands whenever she senses I need company more than she needs an excuse. We sat on my back porch with iced tea, and I mentioned, lightly, the confusion over the cottage and the rescheduled appointment, framing it the way I'd been framing it to myself. Small mix-ups, nothing more. Paige set her glass down very deliberately on the porch rail. "Francis," she said, "I need you to hear me say this plainly, because I don't think you're going to want to. I don't think those were mix-ups. I think my brother is gaslighting you. I had heard the word before, of course, the way you hear a word on television, and file it somewhere, it doesn't quite touch your own life. Hearing it applied to my own dinner table, by a woman who had known Colton since he was a colicky infant and Renata a decade before she married him, landed differently. Why would he do that? I asked, though some part of me, I think, already suspected the shape of the answer. Because Dad left you the trust and left him considerably less than he expected, and Colton has never once, in his entire adult life, believed that was fair, Paige said. He didn't say it at the funeral. He wouldn't. But I grew up in that house with him, Francis. I know what it looks like when Colton has decided something is owed to him. He gets very patient, very gentle. It's the gentleness you have to watch for. My brother has never once raised his voice at anyone he was actually trying to hurt. I want you to sit with that observation for a moment, because it is the truest and most unsettling thing anyone said to me that whole summer. We are taught, most of us, to watch for anger as the signal that something is wrong. Nobody warns you to watch for excessive, well-timed gentleness instead. I told Paige about the ring that afternoon on the porch, too, the first time I'd told anyone, and watching her face while I described the phone call, the emotional time, a lot of things probably blur together, I saw something settle in her that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of finally having your worst private suspicion confirmed by someone else's evidence rather than your own doubted memory. "That's exactly it," she said. "That's exactly the pattern. He did the same thing to me once, years ago, about a card game. Told me I'd agreed to loan him $50. I never actually agreed to loan him, and when I pushed back, he got so calm and so patient about it that I ended up apologizing to him for not remembering right, and I gave him the $50 just to make the conversation stop. I was 19. I've thought about that $50 more times in the last 10 years than any actual amount of money deserves, because it was never about the money. It was about how easily he got me to hand him something just to make him stop being so reasonable at me. I asked her, because I needed to hear the answer from someone who'd known him since he was a boy, whether she thought Colton knew what he was doing, whether this was calculated, or whether it was simply some old, unexamined habit of his, worn smooth by decades of use until it no longer felt like a choice to him at all. Paige was quiet for a long moment, turning her iced tea glass slowly on the porch rail. "I think it started as the second thing," she said finally. "I think he learned, very young, after our parents' divorce, that being the reasonable one got him more than being the angry one ever did. Dad was easier on him when he stayed calm. Mom trusted him more. Teachers liked him better. I think Colton built an entire personality around being the person in the room who never raises his voice, because it worked, over and over, for 30 years. But Francis, I don't think it's unexamined anymore. Not with you. I think somewhere in the last few months, my brother noticed that the thing he's always done by instinct also happens to be useful for something specific, and I think he's started doing it on purpose now. That's the part that scares me, the habit I could forgive. What I'm watching now doesn't look like habit anymore. It looks like a plan. I did not want to believe my stepson capable of a plan, not that summer, not with Edward barely 4 months in the ground. But I trusted Paige's read of her own brother more than I trusted my own hope that she was wrong, and I told her so, and she reached over and squeezed my hand on the porch rail the way she had reached for it once before, half delirious with fever, in a bedroom 30 years and a whole lifetime away from where we now sat. "Keep your own records," she told me, before she left that evening. "Not because I think you're losing anything, Francis, because I think somebody is trying very hard to convince you that you are, and the only defense against that kind of quiet campaign is a quieter, better documented one of your own." I did not confront Colton that week, or the week after. I told Paige, honestly, what I have told you already, that I did not want to act from a feeling alone, however sharply I felt it, and that Edward had not built the life we shared on hunches, and I did not intend to defend it with one either. What I did instead was begin, quietly, to keep my own records, a small notebook kept in the drawer of my nightstand, where I wrote down the date and the exact substance of every phone call, every visit, every small correction Colton offered about something I supposedly remembered wrong. I did not yet know what I was building toward. I only knew that if my own memory was ever going to be questioned in a room where it mattered, I intended to have a more reliable witness to it than my own recollection alone. I intended to have paper. I did not have to wait long before I understood exactly why I needed it. In early August, Colton called to say he'd made me an appointment with a new physician, a geriatric specialist, he explained, someone who could take a more comprehensive look at my overall health now that I was managing things alone. He framed it as thoughtfulness, the same gentle, patient thoughtfulness he'd been offering me all summer. I told him I was perfectly satisfied with Dr. Reyes, whom I'd seen for 11 years. Colton said, in the voice you'd use to reassure a nervous patient, that it never hurt to get a second opinion, especially given how forgetful I'd been lately, and that he'd already confirmed the appointment for the following Tuesday at Ashford Memorial. He hoped I wouldn't make him cancel it after he'd gone to the trouble. I went. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the shape of this story. I went to that appointment still telling myself I was simply being a good sport about my stepson's overbearing concern, not yet willing to believe the darker explanation Paige had already handed me on my back porch. The appointment itself was brief, 11 minutes by my own watch, conducted by a Dr. Alan Petrakis, a man perhaps 10 years younger than Colton, who asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, name the current president, and recall 3 unrelated words after a 5-minute interval. I did all 3 without difficulty. He thanked me, told me the results would go into my file, and that was, as far as I understood it that afternoon, the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. It was, I would learn months later, the entire foundation of what came next. The following week, Colton mentioned, almost in passing over coffee, that he and Renata had been talking with an attorney about options for making sure I was properly looked after as I got older, given how alone I now was in the house. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, what exactly that meant. He told me not to worry about the details, that he only wanted to make sure I had support in place before anything became an emergency, and that he loved me too much to wait until a crisis forced everyone's hand. I called Paige that same evening. She had heard something similar from Renata, vaguer, but pointed in the same direction, something about Colton wanting to formalize a support structure before the end of the year. Neither of us yet had the word for what Colton was actually building. We had, instead, a growing, specific unease, the kind that does not go away when you try to reason yourself out of it, and a small notebook full of dates. Renata came to see me alone 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon while Colton was at work, and I remember being surprised to find her on my porch step without him, twisting her car keys in her hand in a way that told me before she said a word that she hadn't fully decided, even standing there, how much she meant to say. "I don't have long," she told me, not sitting when I offered her a chair. Francis, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because I think I already know the answer, and I'm hoping I'm wrong. Has Colton said anything to you about a support structure? About formalizing something before the end of the year?" I told her he had, in the vague, general way he'd mentioned it over coffee, and watched something in her face go tight and unhappy. "He's been talking to an attorney," she said. "Not Camille, someone else, someone he found on his own, a guardianship specialist, he called him. He had me sit in on one call. Francis, I want to tell you I said something, that I pushed back the way I should have. I didn't. I sat there and I let him talk about protecting you, and I didn't say a single word, because some part of me has been telling myself for months that maybe he's right. Maybe you have slowed down since Edward died. Maybe I'm just not around you enough to see it the way he says he sees it. And then I drove home tonight and I thought about the ring and the cottage, and I realized I don't actually believe any of that. I believe my husband wants something, and I believe he's decided the fastest way to get it runs directly through convincing everyone, including himself, that you can't be trusted anymore. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, why she was telling me this now, in my driveway, rather than simply going home and telling Colton she didn't agree. Renata's eyes filled, quickly, the particular fast tears of someone who has been holding something in far longer than is comfortable. Because I'm afraid of what happens to my marriage if I say it to him directly and he decides I've chosen your side over his, she said, and because I'm more afraid of what happens to you if I say nothing at all, and I don't know yet which fear is going to win. I'm not brave enough tonight to tell you I've already decided. I just wanted you to hear it from me once, clearly, in case I lose my nerve later and go back to being quiet about it. Whatever he's building, Francis, I don't think it's about your safety. I don't think it ever was. She left before I could find the right response, backing out of my driveway too quickly, and I stood on my porch for a long while after her taillights disappeared, turning over what she'd said. I did not yet know that Renata's private, unfinished courage that evening was the first thread of something that would eventually cost her a marriage. I only knew, watching her go, that I had just been handed a second independent confirmation of exactly what Paige had already told me on this same porch weeks earlier, and that whatever comfort I had allowed myself to take in believing this might still be one large misunderstanding was no longer available to me. I added the date to my notebook that night, and beneath it, in handwriting nearly as small and careful as Edward's own had once been, I wrote a single line I would return to often in the months that followed. Renata knows. Renata is afraid. That fear will not last forever, and when it breaks, it will break toward the truth. I called Nathaniel Kessler the next morning. I had spoken with Nathaniel perhaps 4 times in the 11 years since Edward set up the trust. Routine calls, distribution questions, nothing that had ever required urgency. His voice on the phone was measured and unhurried, a man accustomed to being the calm center of other people's financial storms. I told him everything, in order, the cottage, the rescheduled appointment, the new doctor, the vague mention of a support structure. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment when I finished. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, "I want to be direct with you, because I think directness serves you better than caution right now. What you're describing has a shape to it. It's a shape I've seen before, in other families, though rarely executed quite this patiently. I would strongly encourage you to retain your own independent counsel, not the trust's counsel, your own personal attorney, before this goes any further. And I want you to know, clearly, exactly what the trust does and does not protect, so you understand what is and isn't actually at risk." He walked me through it, the same terms Camille had first explained 11 years earlier, but landing differently now, that I could feel their weight pressing against something real. The trust assets, the bulk of what Edward had built, were entirely insulated from any guardianship finding a court might make about my personal capacity. No guardian appointed over my person or my remaining individual assets would have any authority to direct, access, or alter how Nathaniel administered the trust. But Nathaniel was careful to add, a guardianship over my person was not nothing. It could still cost me my home, my medical decisions, my day-to-day autonomy, my dignity, everything the trust had never been designed to protect, because Edward had built it to guard the money, trusting that I would remain capable of guarding myself. If Colton succeeded in having me declared incapacitated, he would not get the fortune he was after, but he could still, quite legally, get me, my house, my schedule, my body, handed over to whatever arrangement a judge approved based on a single 11-minute appointment with a doctor I'd never met before that Tuesday. I retained Camille Ostrander that same week, not as the trust's attorney this time, but as mine, personally, to defend against exactly the kind of petition Nathaniel suspected was coming. Camille, in turn, recommended a man named Derek Holloway, a former state elder abuse investigator who now worked privately, specializing in exactly the pattern I was describing. "What you're up against has a name in my field," Derek told me, at our first meeting in Camille's conference room, a legal pad already open in front of him. "It's called guardianship abuse, and it is disturbingly common and disturbingly profitable, precisely because judges are trained to err on the side of protecting a vulnerable person, and a well-prepared petitioner can make almost anyone look vulnerable enough on paper. I'm going to need everything you have, the notebook, the appointment records, and I'd like to look closely at Dr. Petrakis. An 11-minute cognitive screening producing a formal capacity finding is fast, even for a routine case. I want to understand why he moved that quickly and who asked him to." I studied him while he spoke, a compact, unhurried man in his early 60s with the kind of stillness I'd only otherwise seen in Nathaniel, the particular calm of people whose work requires them to notice things other people miss. Camille had described him, on the phone before our meeting, as the best I know at this specific, ugly, underreported thing, and I asked him, that first afternoon, how a person ends up building a career around uncovering exactly this. "I spent 19 years with the state," Derek said, "adult protective services, then a specialized unit once they finally admitted the caseload justified one. I want to tell you something plainly, Mrs. Sinclair, because I think you deserve to hear it plainly, rather than gently. In 19 years, I saw maybe a dozen cases of the thing people picture when they hear elder abuse. A stranger, a scam, physical harm from someone outside the family. I saw hundreds of cases that looked exactly like what you're describing to me right now. A family member, usually one who feels some old grievance has never been settled, slowly building a case for incapacity out of ordinary human forgetfulness, ordinary grief, ordinary aging, dressed up as decline. It is unglamorous, it rarely makes the news, and it works far more often than it should, because the entire legal system is built, for good reason, to take claims of vulnerability seriously rather than skeptically, and a patient petitioner can exploit that seriousness like a tool. "What made you leave the state and go private?" I asked him. "Budget cuts, mostly, and a case 11 years ago that I still think about some nights," he said, and did not elaborate further, and I did not ask him to. "I do this privately now because I can take fewer cases and go deeper on each one than the state ever let me. I don't need you to convince me this is real, Mrs. Sinclair. The pattern you've described, the isolated small incidents, each individually deniable, each one just plausible enough on its own that objecting to it makes the victim look unreasonable, that pattern has a name in my training materials. We call it the staircase. No single step looks steep enough to complain about. It's only when you stand at the top and look back down that you understand how far you've actually been walked." Camille had been quiet through most of this, making notes on her legal pad, and she looked up now with the particular focus I would come to recognize as her preparing to say something she wanted, remembered exactly as she phrased it. "Francis, I want to be candid about strategy before Derek starts his work, because I think it will help you understand why some of what comes next may feel, at times, like we're moving too slowly. We are not going to react to every incident as it happens. We are going to let Derek build a complete picture, quietly, while you continue living your ordinary life exactly as you have been. The temptation, when you finally have proof of something like this, is to confront the person immediately, out of relief as much as anger. I am going to ask you not to do that. A confrontation now would only teach Colton to be more careful. What we want instead is a single, complete, undeniable presentation, delivered once, in the one room where it will actually matter." I told her I understood, though I did not yet know, sitting in that conference room with a notebook of dates in my purse and a stranger's calm reassurance in my ears, exactly how much discipline that patience would eventually require of me. I gave him the notebook. I gave him 3 months of dates, restated conversations, and quiet, accumulating proof that I had known, on some level, exactly what I was documenting long before I'd had a word for it. Derek thanked me, told me he'd need 2 to 3 weeks, and asked me, before I left, to continue behaving exactly as I had been, warm, unguarded, entirely unaware, with Colton and Renata in the meantime. Let him believe this is working, Derek said. A man who believes he's winning makes mistakes a man who suspects he's being watched never would. I did exactly that. I sat through 2 more Sunday dinners, listening to Colton's gentle, patient concern for my well-being, saying nothing that would tell him I had already begun building the case that would eventually take that concern apart in front of a judge. It was, I will admit, one of the harder disciplines of my life, sitting across a table from a man I had helped raise, letting him believe he had successfully convinced me I was slipping, while a private investigator, 2 towns over, quietly traced the money behind the doctor who'd examined me for 11 minutes. Margaret Doyle came by most Wednesday afternoons during those 19 days, the same Margaret who had warned me so gently at the funeral reception to watch who Colton was at the reading of the will, and I never told her how close her instinct had already proven to being right, because Derek had asked me to keep the circle, who knew as small as possible, until his work was finished. We spent those afternoons in my garden instead, mostly deadheading spent roses and dividing the peonies that had gotten root-bound over the years, ordinary work for ordinary hands, and I found I needed that ordinariness more than I would have admitted to anyone directly. There is a particular strain in carrying a secret, that large through conversations that small, asking Margaret about her grandson's soccer season, listening to her complain good-naturedly about her knee, while some other part of my mind sat permanently in Camille's conference room, waiting for a phone call that would either confirm or dissolve the worst thing I had let myself imagine about my own stepson. "You're somewhere else today," Margaret told me, on the second Wednesday, kneeling beside me in the dirt, with a trowel in one gloved hand. "You have been for a couple weeks now, if I'm honest. Is it just the grief catching up with you, or is something else going on that you're not telling an old woman about?" I told her, as close to the truth as I could manage without breaking my word to Derek, that I was simply tired in a way sleep didn't seem to fix, which was true enough on its own that it didn't feel like a lie. Margaret studied me for a moment, with the particular unhurried attention of a woman who has outlived 2 husbands and buried enough friends to have stopped pretending she couldn't tell when someone was carrying more than they were saying. "Whatever it is," she said finally, going back to her trowel, "you come from sturdy people, Francis. I watched you nurse your own mother through her last 2 years without once losing your temper at a single one of the ungrateful things grief makes people say to the person taking care of them. Whatever's sitting on you right now, you'll carry it the same way. I just want you to know you don't have to carry it alone. Whenever you're ready to stop pretending you're only tired." I nearly told her everything, that afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with my hands full of dead rose stems. I did not, in the end, because Derek's instruction had been specific, and I trusted his reasons for it, even when I chafed against them. But I have never forgotten the particular comfort of being seen that clearly by someone who did not need the details to offer exactly the right kind of company, and I understood, watching Margaret's steady, unbothered hands working the soil beside mine, that I was not nearly as alone in that long, quiet wait as the secrecy of it sometimes made me feel. There were harder evenings, too, evenings Margaret didn't see, when the ordinary business of the day finished and the house went quiet, and I sat at the same kitchen table where Edward used to read his newspaper, turning the whole summer over in my mind and finding, more than once, a version of myself frightened enough to wonder whether Derek would find nothing at all, whether I had built an entire private case against my own stepson out of grief and a missing ring that had never actually been missing and a phone call about a dock repair, I want to be honest that doubt visited me often in those 19 days, and that it did not always announce itself gently, but I kept writing in the notebook anyway, every date, every detail, because Edward had taught me, in 31 years of watching him work, that you build the structure according to the plan, even on the days you cannot yet see what it's going to hold. Derek called on a Wednesday morning, 19 days after our first meeting, and asked if I could come to Camille's office that afternoon. I asked him, the way I imagine everyone asks that question, whether it was bad. It's significant, he said. I'd rather show you than tell you over the phone. I drove to Camille's office that afternoon, with my hands steadier on the wheel than I expected them to be. Some part of me, I think, had already been preparing for whatever waited in that conference room, since the morning Colton told me not to worry about a dock repair I'd never asked him to cancel. Derek had a folder open on the table when I sat down, Camille beside him with a legal pad of her own. Before I start, Derek said, I want you to know this is going to be difficult to hear, not because it's complicated, but because it's going to make plain exactly how long and how deliberately this was planned. Take your time with it. He slid the first page toward me. It was a standard business record, an invoice issued by a private consulting entity called Petrakis Geriatric Consulting LLC, addressed not to any hospital or insurance provider, but to Colton Sinclair personally, dated the same week as my 11-minute appointment. The line item read, simply, Expedited Capacity Assessment and Consultation, $4,200. Dr. Petrakis runs a side practice, Derek explained, offering what he calls expedited independent evaluations, paid directly by a family member rather than billed through insurance. It's not, strictly speaking, illegal on its face. Private pay medical consultations happen every day. What makes this one a problem is everything around it. I pulled Dr. Petrakis' disciplinary history with the state medical board, 2 prior complaints, both dismissed for insufficient evidence, both alleging the same thing, rapid capacity findings, produced for a paying family member, in guardianship disputes that were later contested. Nobody's made it stick yet, but the pattern is not subtle, once you know to look for it. I sat with that for a long moment, thinking of 11 minutes, 3 unrelated words, counting backward by 7s. I had passed every question he asked me. And still, somehow, his letter to the court had characterized me as showing early signs of impaired judgment and increased vulnerability to undue influence, findings that appeared nowhere in the actual examination I remembered taking. There's more, Camille said gently, and turned the folder to the second document. This one was a printed exchange of text messages obtained lawfully through the same forensic channels Derek used in every investigation of this kind, between Colton and Renata, dated back to April, 1 month after Edward's funeral, 6 weeks before the dock repair phone call had somehow become a conversation about selling the cottage. I read it slowly, twice, before I let myself believe what it said. Colton, I talked to a guy at the club whose mother went through something similar. He said the key is documentation. Start logging every little slip now, even small stuff, so by the time we need it there's a paper trail that doesn't look sudden. Renata, are you sure this is the right move? She seems fine to me, honestly. She's fine, now. That's not the point. Dad structured everything to keep me out completely, and I'm not going to just accept that forever. If we can show a pattern of decline over a few months, guardianship gives us standing to at least get the arrangement reviewed. Worst case, it doesn't work, and she's annoyed with me for a while. Best case, we finally get what should have been mine to begin with. I set the page down carefully. I want to tell you honestly that this was the moment, the last small, stubborn part of me that had been making excuses for my stepson finally, completely, let go. Not the cottage, not the appointment. This, 6 weeks before he ever mentioned a new doctor to me, Colton had already been telling his wife, in writing, that the entire plan was to manufacture a pattern of decline that did not exist, in service of money his own father had specifically, deliberately, decided not to leave in his direct control. "There's one final piece," Derek said, "and I think it's the piece that actually explains why he moved as fast and as confidently as he did." He turned to a third document, a page from Ashford Memorial Hospital's public annual report, a list of institutional donors, the kind of document nobody reads except accountants and people looking for exactly what Derek had found. Halfway down the page, under a heading for the hospital's Geriatric Assessment and Ethics Program, was a line reading, "The Sinclair Family Foundation, Founding Sustaining Partner, Geriatric Ethics and Capacity Review Initiative. Your husband's charitable foundation," Derek said, "has funded Ashford Memorial's entire Geriatric Ethics Board for the past 6 years. That's the very body responsible for the standards and oversight Dr. Petrakis is theoretically supposed to be held to. I don't believe Dr. Petrakis was thinking about that connection when he took Colton's $4,000. I don't think he made the link at all. But it means the foundation your husband built, the one that funds the very program meant to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, was, until you and Nathaniel Kessler step in, indirectly propping up the credibility of the man who wrote the letter meant to take your independence away." I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, more grief than humor, sitting in that conference room. Edward had spent the last decade of his life quietly building 2 separate kinds of protection, a trust no guardian could touch, and a foundation meant to fund exactly the kind of ethical oversight that was supposed to prevent doctors like Alan Petrakis from selling capacity findings to the highest bidder. He had built both without ever imagining they would one day collide directly over his own wife's dining room table in the hands of his own son. "There's one more thing," Derek said, and something in the careful way he said it told me he had saved it deliberately for last. He turned to a final page, the formation record for Petrakis Geriatric Consulting LLC, filed with the state 11 months earlier, 5 months before Edward died. "I want you to notice the date, Mrs. Sinclair. Dr. Petrakis didn't set up this side practice in response to your situation. He set it up first, as a going concern, clearly built to solicit exactly this kind of business, family members willing to pay out of pocket for a fast, favorable capacity finding, no insurance paper trail, no referral history to raise questions. Colton didn't stumble onto a doctor willing to bend the truth for money. He went looking for one, and this LLC is precisely the kind of thing a careful search would eventually turn up, if you knew what phrases to search for. I found 3 online forums for family caregivers where a service like this gets discussed in exactly the coded language you'd expect. Expedited assessment, private pay, faster turnaround. I don't know exactly how Colton found Dr. Petrakis. I know he wasn't the first family to find him, and based on the disciplinary history, he won't be the last, unless somebody stops this." I asked Derek, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, how he had lawfully obtained the text messages between Colton and Renata, because some part of me, even in the middle of everything else that morning, needed to understand that the ground beneath this evidence was solid. Fair question, and an important one, because if the source is bad, none of this holds up in front of a judge, Derek said. The messages came from a shared family cloud backup account, one Colton set up himself 4 years ago, for what he described at the time as everyone's convenience, so photos and documents could be accessed by the whole family without emailing files back and forth. Renata's phone was still linked to it. She never removed it after they married, and Colton, as far as I can tell, forgot it existed at all, the way people generally do forget a convenience they set up once and never thought about again. Camille has already confirmed the retrieval method is clean. No hacking, no deception, simply an account Colton voluntarily created and never secured, containing messages sent through it in the ordinary course of its use. I want you to have that confirmation clearly in your mind, Mrs. Sinclair, because I suspect, Before this is over, his attorney is going to try very hard to convince a judge otherwise. There was a strange, bitter symmetry in that detail that I did not fully appreciate until I was driving home that evening, that the very account Colton had built 4 years earlier to make the family's life more convenient had quietly preserved, without his knowledge, the clearest possible record of exactly how inconvenient he had since decided my presence in that family had become. Edward used to tell me that most structural failures trace back to a single small decision made years before anyone thought to question it, a beam sized correctly for the load it was expected to carry, and never revisited as the load quietly grew. I have come to think people are not so different from bridges in that respect. Colton's downfall was not the ring, or the cottage, or even Dr. Petrakis in the end. It was a convenience account, set up in a moment of genuine goodwill 4 years before he needed it to disappear, that he simply never thought to examine again once his purposes had changed. Camille closed the folder gently when Derek finished and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "I know this is a great deal to absorb at once," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering it, because how you answer it will shape everything we do from here. Do you want justice, Francis, or do you want peace? I ask because they are not always the same request, and I have represented enough people in situations like yours to know it matters which one you're actually asking me to fight for." I did not answer her quickly. I sat with the question the way Edward would have sat with a load calculation that didn't balance on the first pass, turning it over until I trusted my own answer rather than the first one that arrived. "I want my life back exactly the way it was before any of this started," I told her finally. "I don't need Colton to suffer for the rest of his life over this. I need him to stop, and I need a judge to understand clearly enough that he can never try it again. If justice is what gets me there, I'll take justice, but it was never the thing I went looking for." Camille nodded slowly, as though I had passed some quiet test she hadn't told me I was taking. "That's the client I was hoping you'd be," she said. "It's also, in my experience, the version of this case that plays best in front of a judge. Judges trust restraint. We're going to give him exactly that, the truth, laid out plainly, without a single ounce more anger in it than the facts themselves already carry." "What do I do with this?" I asked Camille, when I trusted my voice again. "You let it wait," she said. "Colton doesn't know we have it. Derek's investigation has left no trace he'd notice. If we move too early, he adjusts, delays, finds another doctor, buries the text messages deeper. I want to file our opposition and present every piece of this at once, in front of a judge, in a way that leaves him no room to reframe it as a misunderstanding. That means letting him take his best shot at the guardianship petition first, fully believing he's already won, before we show him exactly what we've been holding the entire time." I told her that was precisely the approach I had already begun to expect I would need. I did not yet know how soon, or how sharply, Colton was about to force our hand. 3 days later, a process server knocked on my front door at 8:30 in the morning, while I was still in my robe with a pot of coffee half brewed. The papers he handed me were an emergency petition for temporary guardianship filed by Colton the previous afternoon, supported by Dr. Petrakis' letter, and a sworn declaration describing, in careful, sympathetic language, a woman who had grown confused, isolated, and increasingly unable to manage the ordinary business of her own life since her husband's death. A judge had already reviewed it, on an emergency basis, without my knowledge and without my presence, and had granted a temporary order effective immediately, a court-appointed temporary guardian, a stranger named Mr. Whitfield, no relation I would learn later, simply a coincidence of a common name that struck me as almost cruel the first time I heard it, given everything the actual Whitfields of my acquaintance would have made of this, would have authority over my medical decisions and daily affairs for the next 21 days, pending a full evidentiary hearing. I was permitted to remain in my own home, the order noted, but only with a court-approved in-home aide present at all times, and I was barred from making any decisions regarding my personal property, my medical care, or my finances, outside the trust, without the temporary guardian's written approval. I called Camille from my kitchen table, the papers spread in front of me, exactly the way, I would think much later, Colton's own capacity letter must have once sat on some clerk's desk, waiting for a judge's signature. My hands were not steady this time. I want to be honest about that. There is a particular, specific terror in having a stranger granted legal authority over your own body and your own front door, however temporary, however lawful, however certain you are that it will not last. Camille's voice on the phone was calm, in a way that helped me find my own calm again. "This is exactly the move Derek predicted," she said. "He didn't wait for the full hearing because he suspected, correctly, that if he gave us more time, we'd find something. He's trying to establish control before we can build our defense. It's aggressive, and it's legal, and it is also, Francis, a mistake, because it means he's shown us his entire hand 3 weeks earlier than he needed to. We have 21 days now instead of an open timeline. That's tighter than I would have liked. It's still enough. I will not pretend those 21 days were easy." Mr. Whitfield, the court-appointed temporary guardian, turned out to be a decent, overworked man, managing 11 other cases besides mine, who reviewed my situation with visible discomfort once he actually met me and spent 20 minutes in ordinary conversation, but who told me, apologetically, that his hands were bound by the order, regardless of his own private impression of my capacity. The in-home aide, a kind young woman named Charisse, who I came to like a great deal by the end of those 3 weeks, sat in my kitchen every day reading paperback novels, while I gardened and cooked and lived a life that looked, from the outside, almost entirely ordinary, except for the fact that I could not write a check without Mr. Whitfield's signature and could not so much as change my own pharmacy without his approval. Charisse and I fell into an easy rhythm faster than either of us expected, given the strange circumstances that had put her in my kitchen in the first place. She was perhaps 30, working her way through a nursing degree at night, kind in a plain, unperformed way that I came to trust within the first 2 days, simply by watching how she treated me when she assumed I wasn't paying attention, no different, gentler, if anything, than how she treated me directly. On the 4th day, over tea, she told me, apologetically, that she'd taken dozens of these placements over the years, and that mine was one of the few where she genuinely couldn't understand, watching me garden and cook and hold entirely ordinary conversations, why the court order existed at all. "I'm not supposed to say that," she added quickly. "I'm supposed to stay neutral, but you asked me to pass the salt at dinner instead of just reaching for it because you didn't want to seem presumptuous in your own kitchen, Mrs. Sinclair." I don't know what I expected when they told me this assignment, but it wasn't a woman apologizing for reaching across her own table. I asked her, one afternoon in the 2nd week, whether she'd ever worked a placement where the order actually had been necessary, where the family's fear had been justified rather than manufactured. She considered the question seriously before she answered, the way I'd come to notice she considered most things. "A few," she said. "You can usually tell within a day. The confusion is different, less about specific facts and more about the whole shape of a conversation slipping away mid-sentence. What you have isn't that. What you have is a woman who remembers exactly what she's annoyed about not being allowed to do for herself." She smiled slightly. "I've made a note of that in my reports every week, for what it's worth. Not that it's my place to decide the outcome. But it's my job to observe accurately, and I intend to keep doing that, regardless of which side finds it convenient. Mr. Whitfield himself, I saw only 4 times during those 21 days, a tired, courteous man, managing what he told me, with visible discomfort, was a caseload built for half his actual number of files. On his 2nd visit, reviewing a request I'd submitted simply to reorder my own blood pressure medication before it ran out, he sat across from me at the kitchen table for a full 20 minutes longer than the paperwork required, asking about Edward, about the garden, about a framed photograph of Paige and Lily on the windowsill, and at the end of it he signed the approval without a moment's hesitation and told me, quietly, folding his reading glasses back into his jacket pocket, that he saw a great many cases where the order matched the person in front of him, and a smaller number where it plainly did not, and that he would let his own report reflect, honestly, which category he believed mine belonged to. "I can't undo the order," he told me, standing at my front door before he left. "That's not within my authority, and I won't pretend otherwise just to make either of us feel better about it. But I want you to know, I'm not sleepwalking through this one, Mrs. Sinclair. Whatever happens at the full hearing, it won't be because nobody was paying attention in the meantime." I thanked him, and meant it, though I remember standing at that door, after his car pulled away, thinking that decency from a stranger, however genuine, is a strange kind of comfort to need in your own home, and that I would trade every ounce of Mr. Whitfield's kindness in an instant for the simple, unremarkable freedom to sign my own name to my own life again without anyone's permission at all. I marked each of the 21 days on the kitchen calendar where I had once circled the date of a dock repair that never needed circling in the first place, crossing off mornings the way I imagine a person crosses off days on a sentence, not because the days themselves were unbearable, but because I had learned, over one very long summer, that counting carefully was the only defense I had ever really needed against people who assumed I wasn't paying close enough attention to count at all. Colton visited twice during those 21 days. Both times, he arrived with the same gentle, sorrowful concern he'd been performing since May, telling me how much it pained him to see me in this position, how he hoped I understood this was, ultimately, an act of love. I let him say it. I did not tell him what sat in Camille's office, 3 miles away, in a folder with his own handwriting adjacent texts inside it. Paige came far more often, furious in a way she worked hard to keep contained in front of Charisse and Mr. Whitfield, holding my hand at my own kitchen table and telling me quietly that her brother was going to regret every single day of this once the truth came out. "I know," I told her, "but I need you to understand something, Paige. I am not looking forward to his regret. I am looking forward to my own front door belonging to me again. Those are not quite the same thing, and I want to be careful not to let the second one curdle into the first. I want you to hear that distinction clearly, because it is, I think, the most important thing I can tell you about how I got through those 3 weeks without losing something in myself that would have been far harder to win back than a guardianship order. I was not building toward revenge. I was building toward the simple, unglamorous restoration of the life Edward and I had built together, undisturbed by anyone who had decided, quietly and gently, and over the course of one difficult summer, that grief had made me an opportunity, rather than a mother-in-law. The full evidentiary hearing was scheduled for the 22nd day, a Thursday, in the same county courthouse where Edward and I had once gone to update our wills, in a hearing room that smelled, as I told you at the very start of this, like old carpet and cold coffee. I wore the navy dress from his memorial. I sat with my hands folded over my reading glasses, and I let Colton's attorney speak first, exactly the way Camille and I had planned, and I let my stepson lean toward me and tell me, gently, patiently, that this wasn't about the money, it was about keeping me safe from myself. And then it was my turn. Camille rose slowly, the way she had told me she would, no hurry in it at all. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by calling Nathaniel Kessler to the stand, trustee of the Edward Sinclair Irrevocable Trust." Nathaniel testified first, plainly and without embellishment, walking the judge through exactly what the trust did and did not allow, that no guardianship finding regarding my person could reach the assets Edward had spent his career building, that the trust had been established 11 years earlier, long before any dispute existed, specifically to insulate the estate from precisely this category of family conflict, and that he, as an independent corporate trustee with no relationship to any Sinclair family member, had no financial or personal incentive of any kind in the outcome of this proceeding. Colton's attorney tried, briefly, to suggest the trust itself was somehow evidence of my diminished capacity. Why would a woman need such elaborate protection unless someone anticipated she'd eventually be unable to protect herself? Nathaniel answered that question with a patience that made the objection sound smaller with every word. The trust was Mr. Sinclair's decision, made while he was in full possession of his own considerable faculties. As a structural engineer, plans for loads a bridge will probably never carry, he said. It reflects prudence, not prediction. I've administered over 200 trusts in my career, sir. The careful ones are rarely the ones that end up in a courtroom like this. Camille called Dr. Reyes next, my internist of 11 years, unpaid by anyone, with no stake whatsoever in the outcome, who testified that in her professional opinion, formed over more than a decade of regular visits, I showed no signs of cognitive decline consistent with the 11-minute assessment Dr. Petrakis had produced, and that a single brief screening, conducted by a physician with no prior relationship to the patient, was not the standard of care she would expect to see relied upon for a finding this consequential. Colton's attorney rose to cross-examine her, a young man with an expensive suit and the slightly too eager manner of someone who had prepared a sharper line of questioning than the moment actually called for. Dr. Reyes, isn't it true that cognitive decline can present suddenly, even in patients with no prior history? Isn't it possible Mrs. Sinclair's condition simply changed in the months since your last examination of her? It's possible, Dr. Reyes said, unhurried. It's also possible to test for. That's precisely why the standard of care in a case of this consequence calls for a comprehensive geriatric assessment, multiple visits, collateral history from people who actually know the patient day to day, often neuroimaging where warranted, rather than a single 11-minute screening conducted by a physician meeting the patient for the first time. I'm not testifying that Mrs. Sinclair definitely has no cognitive impairment of any kind, counselor. I'm testifying that nobody in this proceeding has actually done the work required to know that one way or the other, and that the party responsible for that gap is the one who commissioned the only assessment that exists. The attorney tried a second angle, asking whether Dr. Reyes could say with certainty that I hadn't declined at all since her last visit 8 months earlier. I can say she scored appropriately on every measure I administered 9 days ago, at Miss Ostrander's request, using a full standardized battery rather than a 3-question screen, Dr. Reyes replied, and I watched the attorney's shoulders drop very slightly, the particular deflation of a man realizing his prepared question had walked directly into an answer he hadn't accounted for. He had no further questions after that. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Judge Alvarez, who had said almost nothing through the first hour of testimony beyond routine procedural rulings, leaned forward slightly at this point and addressed Dr. Reyes directly, which Camille told me afterward was itself a meaningful sign, because judges in a full evidentiary hearing typically let the attorneys carry the questioning unless something has genuinely caught their attention. Doctor, in your professional opinion, is an 11-minute assessment, standing alone, ever sufficient grounds for a capacity finding of this magnitude? In my professional opinion, Your Honor, no, Dr. Reyes said. Not for a finding that could result in someone losing control of their own home, their own medical decisions, and their own daily life. I would not make a determination that consequential about a stranger's car after an 11-minute test drive. I certainly wouldn't make one about a person's mind. I watched Judge Alvarez write something down at that, unhurried, and I understood, watching her pen move across the page, that whatever else happened in that room over the following hour, we had just landed the first blow that actually mattered. Then Camille turned to the judge and said the sentence I had been waiting 3 weeks to hear spoken aloud in that room. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to enter into evidence a series of documents obtained through a licensed investigator, which I believe bear directly on the credibility of the medical opinion this petition depends on entirely. She walked the invoice to the bench first. Petrakis Geriatric Consulting LLC, $4,200, billed directly to Colton Sinclair, dated the same week as my examination. The judge read it in silence, then looked up, not at me, but at Colton. Mr. Sinclair, the judge said, did you personally pay Dr. Petrakis for this evaluation, outside of any standard insurance billing? Colton's attorney stood to object, On some ground I did not fully follow, and the judge overruled him without much patience. Colton, after a long pause, admitted that yes, he had paid for an expedited private consultation because he wanted results quickly, out of concern for my welfare. Camille did not raise her voice. She simply produced the second document, Dr. Petrakis's 2 prior disciplinary complaints, both alleging the identical pattern, both involving family-paid expedited assessments in contested guardianship matters, and let the judge read it in the same unhurried silence. Then she produced the third document, the text messages. I watched Colton's face while Camille read them into the record, his own words, in his own handwriting, 6 weeks before I'd ever met Dr. Petrakis. If we can show a pattern of decline over a few months, guardianship gives us standing to at least get the arrangement reviewed. Best case, we finally get what should have been mine to begin with. I watched something in my stepson's face come apart that I had never once seen in 31 years of knowing him. Not anger, which I had braced for, but something closer to a boy, caught in a lie so complete there was no longer any smaller lie left to retreat to. Your Honor, Camille said, the petitioner's entire case rests on a capacity finding produced by a physician who was paid privately by the petitioner himself, has a documented history of producing similarly rapid findings in similarly contested family disputes, and whose oversight body, the Geriatric Ethics Program at Ashford Memorial, is itself funded, coincidentally, by a charitable foundation established by my client's late husband. We are not asking the court to find that Dr. Petrakis acted with corrupt intent toward that foundation specifically. We are asking the court to recognize that a $4,000 payment from the petitioner to the examining physician, undisclosed to this court until today, fundamentally undermines the reliability of the only medical evidence this petition depends on. And we are asking the court to consider that the petitioner himself, in writing, described his goal not as protecting his stepmother, but as obtaining, in his own words, standing to get the arrangement reviewed, in pursuit of an inheritance he believed should have been his. The judge set the pages down slowly and looked at Colton for a long moment before he spoke. Mr. Sinclair, he said, I have reviewed hundreds of guardianship petitions in this courtroom. Most of them are exactly what they claim to be. Families frightened for someone they love, doing their imperfect best with limited information. I do not believe that is what happened here. I am dismissing this petition in its entirety. The temporary guardianship is terminated, effective immediately. Mrs. Sinclair's full authority over her own person and her remaining property is restored as of this moment. He paused, and his voice hardened further. I am also referring the conduct of Dr. Alan Petrakis to the State Medical Board for review, and I would strongly encourage Mrs. Sinclair's counsel to consider whether this matter warrants referral to the county prosecutor's office as well, given what appears on this record to be a deliberate, paid effort to manufacture false medical evidence in a court proceeding. I did not smile. I did not look at Colton with triumph, though I will not pretend some old, tired part of me did not feel something loosen in my chest that had been clenched since the process server knocked on my door 3 weeks earlier. I simply reached over, picked up my reading glasses from the table where I had set them down at the very start of that hearing, and put them back on, the way you put your own life back on when a stranger finally hands it back to you. Colton did not look at me as the bailiff helped gather the petitioner's table's scattered papers. Renata was not in the courtroom that day. I would learn later that she had told Colton, 3 days before the hearing, that she would not sit beside him in a room while he did this, and that whatever the outcome, she needed him to understand she thought it was wrong. Paige sat behind me the entire hearing, and when the judge finished speaking, she put her hand on my shoulder and left it there, saying nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing to say. The weeks that followed were not simple, and I do not want to tell you they were, because a story that wraps its hardest parts too neatly rarely stays honest for very long. The state medical board suspended Dr. Petrakis's license pending a full investigation within a month, and I later learned, through Derek, that at least one of his 2 earlier dismissed complaints was reopened once investigators understood they were no longer looking at an isolated allegation, but a pattern with a paper trail behind it. The county prosecutor's office reviewed the text messages and the invoice, and 6 months later charged Colton with attempted fraud in connection with a court proceeding, a lesser charge than Camille had initially hoped for, but a criminal charge nonetheless, one that ended, after a plea agreement, in probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent record that will follow my stepson for the rest of his life in ways I take no pleasure in describing. Camille asked me, before the plea agreement was finalized, whether I wanted to submit a victim impact statement urging a harsher outcome, and I sat with that question for the better part of a week before I answered her. I thought about Colton at 19, teaching himself to change a car battery in our driveway because he refused to ask Edward for help and refused, just as stubbornly, to let it beat him. I thought about the boy at the baseball fence who told me I didn't have to keep showing up, and about the man, 30 years later, who had decided, in some private accounting I still do not fully understand, that showing up that long entitled him to take what he could not simply ask for. I told Camille I did not want to argue for the harshest available outcome. I wanted the record to reflect exactly what happened, plainly and completely, and I wanted the court to decide the consequence on the facts alone, without either my forgiveness or my anger weighing on the scale. She told me that was, in her considerable experience, a harder position to hold than either extreme, and she respected it more for the difficulty. Dr. Petrakis's medical board hearing was public record, and Derek attended on my behalf, so I would not have to sit in a room with the man again, and told me afterward that the board's investigator had uncovered a 3rd dismissed complaint neither of us had known about, older than the first 2, involving a family in a neighboring county who had eventually settled a civil claim privately rather than pursue it publicly. The board suspended his license for 18 months, with reinstatement contingent on a formal ethics review. Derek said he did not expect Dr. Petrakis to pass. I felt, hearing that news, less satisfaction than I expected to feel, and more a kind of tired relief that the Geriatric Ethics Board Edwards Foundation had funded for 6 years had finally, belatedly, done the job it existed to do, even if it had taken my own case to force the reckoning. The Ashford Memorial Hospital Board, once the full picture became public through the court record, quietly severed its relationship with Dr. Petrakis's private consulting practice and, at the recommendation of its own ethics committee, adopted a new policy requiring any capacity assessment used in a legal proceeding to be reviewed by a second, independent physician before it could be entered into evidence anywhere in the county. Nathaniel told me, with the closest thing to satisfaction I ever heard in his voice, across all our years of routine calls, that the hospital's general counsel had specifically credited the Sinclair matter in the policy memo, without using my name, which felt like exactly the right kind of legacy for a mess I had never asked to be part of. Not my name attached to a scandal, but a quiet procedural safeguard that might spare some other family the same 19 days of waiting I had once had to survive. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the legal outcome itself. I did not celebrate when I heard about the charges. I felt, mostly, a tired, complicated grief for the boy I had once tried, gently, and for 31 years, to become someone else's family for, and for whatever it was in him that had decided, in the raw first months of his own father's death, that the fastest way to feel less powerless was to take something from a woman he'd never quite let himself trust. Renata separated from Colton 4 months after the hearing. She reached out to me once, in a brief, careful letter, to say she was sorry, that she should have said something the moment he first mentioned the notebook of documented decline, and that she hoped I understood she had never believed I was actually confused, only that she had been too afraid of her own marriage to say so out loud in time. I wrote back and told her I understood fear better than she might expect, and that I hoped she found her own footing wherever she landed next. I have not heard from Colton directly since the hearing, beyond a single terse email, sent the week his probation began, informing me he would not be attending any future family gatherings I might host. I did not write back. Some doors, I have learned, are kinder to leave exactly as someone else chose to close them. Paige and I grew closer that year than we had in the entire 3 decades before it. She started coming for Sunday dinner in Colton's old seat, not to replace him, but because the table had room, and because grief and gratitude, it turns out, are better carried by 2 people than by 1. She brought her daughter, my step-granddaughter Lily, more often after that, a bright, curious 7-year-old who has taken, over the past year, to sitting at Edward's old desk in the study and asking me to explain what all the framed bridge photographs on the wall actually are, which is, I think, exactly the kind of quiet inheritance Edward would have wanted passed down, not the money, not even the trust, but the patient, specific curiosity of a child who wants to understand how something is built well enough to last. Lily asked me once, this past spring, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Edward's study with one of his old bridge photographs propped against her knees, whether her grandfather had been a superhero. I told her, honestly, that he hadn't been, that he'd simply been a careful man who did unglamorous work well, year after year, without ever needing anyone to notice how carefully he'd done it. She considered that for a while, the way 7-year-olds consider things that matter more than the adults around them usually realize, and then she asked whether careful counted as a kind of superpower anyway, since it had apparently ended up saving me from something bad. I did not have a quick answer for her. I have thought about her question often since, turning it over the way I once watched Edward turn over a load calculation that didn't balance on the first pass, and I have come to believe the honest answer is yes, that carefulness, practiced patiently enough and for long enough, over decades rather than moments, is very possibly the only kind of superpower that actually holds up under real weight, precisely because it doesn't announce itself, doesn't perform, doesn't ask to be believed in advance. It simply waits, quietly, fully assembled, for the one day it turns out to have been necessary all along. Margaret Doyle still comes by most Wednesdays, and I finally told her, the week after the hearing, how close her instinct at the funeral reception had come to the truth. She did not say I told you so, which I have always respected about her, and simply asked whether I wanted help planting bulbs for the spring, which felt like exactly the right response to receive after a year like that one. Nathaniel Kessler and I speak now, perhaps 6 times a year, rather than 4, mostly routine matters, though our conversations have taken on a warmth they never quite had before the hearing, the specific warmth, I think, of 2 people who went through something difficult together and came out the other side with their trust in each other fully intact. Derek Holloway sent a card at Christmas, simply signed, and I keep it in the same drawer where the notebook once lived, though the notebook itself I finally retired to a shoebox in the closet, its work, as I told you, long finished. I do not know what became of the attorney who represented Colton that day. I never learned his name well enough to remember it, which feels, in its own small way, like exactly the right amount of space he deserves to occupy in this story. I asked Nathaniel Kessler, about 8 months after the hearing, whether the trust's charitable arm could be expanded. Edward's original foundation had funded hospital wings and engineering scholarships, and, without either of us fully realizing the irony at the time, a geriatric ethics board that very nearly failed the exact test it existed to prevent. I wanted to add something new, a legal aid fund, specifically for elderly people facing guardianship petitions they could not afford to contest alone, administered independently, the same way Edward had insisted his own trust be administered independently, by people with no family stake in the outcome. Nathaniel drew up the structure within a month. We named it, at Paige's quiet suggestion, the Sinclair Bridge Fund, Edward's word, doing one more piece of careful, load-bearing work, long after he was gone from this world to see it. It is autumn again now, a full year past that cold hearing room, and I still keep the small notebook from my nightstand drawer, though it sits closed most days, its work long finished. I sit some mornings at the kitchen table, where Edward read his last newspaper, coffee going warm instead of cold beside me this time, and I look out at the yard and think about how close I came to losing the plain, ordinary shape of my own life to a letter written by a man I'd met for 11 minutes, paid for by a boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway. I think, too, about that no, it was not rainy, it was an ordinary Tuesday morning, 11 years ago, walking into Camille Ostrander's office, with Edward beside me, both of us a little unsure why a healthy man in his 60s needed to spend 3 hours planning for a version of the future neither of us wanted to imagine too closely. I have come to believe that is the entire nature of real love, over the length of an actual lifetime rather than the length of a single grateful moment. It is not the grand gesture, it is the unglamorous, patient work of protecting someone from people and situations you cannot yet name, simply because you refuse to bet everything on the hope that you'll never need to. If there is one thing I would ask you to carry away from this story, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from tonight, it is this: grief does not make you foolish, and gentleness is not always kindness. You are allowed to notice when someone's concern for you starts to look, on closer inspection, like an inventory of everything you own. You are allowed to keep your own quiet records, your own quiet witnesses, your own quiet plans, long before anyone forces your hand, and you are allowed to let the people who underestimate you keep believing, right up until the moment it no longer serves you to let them, that you are exactly as lost as they've decided to call you. Sometimes, the deepest act of love someone leaves you is not a fortune. It is a bridge, built to hold weight nobody wanted to imagine it would ever have to carry, and the quiet, patient trust that you would know, when the day finally came, how to walk across it. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you have ever had someone question your mind while quietly reaching for what was yours, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you're carrying tonight that you've never said out loud to anyone. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong. And if you believe that a lifetime of careful love deserves to be protected, not picked apart, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story. Because every one of us deserves a family who trusts what we know about our own lives, especially, most of all, when we are the only ones left who remember how carefully it was built.